Once we were as pearls and diamonds to the princes of our kind. Once we led the hosts against the servants of the infernal, and laid hands on the greatest of Cain's childer. Once our place was assured. No longer. Now we are the hunted, the betrayed, the despised. These are our final nights. Read our tale, and know that some night it could be thine own. They say that a lie can travel halfway across the world before the truth has even got its boots on, and I am inclined to agree, especially when that lie is a convenient excuse to further powerful people's ambitions. Many believe that the reason the Tremere were allowed to hunt the Salubri to near extinction is because of their successful campaign to smear the name of Saulot and his kin. That the Warlocks somehow managed to convince the Cainites of the world that the clan which they had shared thousands of years together with was in fact one of demon worshippers and cruel monsters of Amaranth. Wicked and twisted, capable of atrocities beyond belief, and plotting against their fellow Cainites. Foolishness. The elders of the clans permitted the destruction of Saulot and the hunt of his blood, fully conscious of the clan's innocence of these charges. They took great joy in seeing the proud and virtuous Salubri being hunted like dogs, slain on their doorsteps as they pretended to shun these sinners and their wrongful ways. Surely some young vampires were convinced by these lies, but they and their opinion mattered little in the end. These nights the lie has become so comfortable and so convenient that even those elders who might have had second thoughts about allowing for this genocide have convinced themselves that they much prefer the company of the Tremere. After all, they tell themselves, the Warlocks keep their own counsel and they support the Ivory Tower unquestioningly. Yet in these modern nights, the pyramid crumbles at the foundation, while the progeny of Saulot make their presence known to the rest of the world. We truly live in interesting times. But long before the usurpers had stolen their immortality, long before the third generation betrayed their sires, Saulot lived in the first city. Saulot was embraced because he was a prophet, or at least he had a gift of such. But his embrace was not without problems, and it left him deeply unsatisfied with his state of being. He disliked his reliance on blood and the scheming nature of his siblings. As a mortal, he had been a lover of peace and a tender of animals, traits that he retained in unlife and which made his grandsire Cain grow fond of him. Yet his peers often thought him odd and senseless, only Malkav and Set understanding his disposition. Thus they were often seen together in discussion on spiritual and philosophical matters. But ultimately Saulot, like all others of Cain's descent, could not stem the beast that tore at his heart and drove his hunger onward, no matter how hard he tried. He, like the others, would eventually go on to create his own progeny, which would be called the Healers. Saulot chose his childer from wise men and women who were skilled in medicine and care, for even in the time of Enoch, the first city, he disliked the death and misery brought on by his kind. These healers would not be allowed to feed on unwilling victims, and indeed would only receive blood from those they had aided as recompense for their skills and treatment. It is unknown if Saulot participated in the destruction of the second generation, or if he had left the city on one of his many travels, but considering his disposition, it is not impossible, for he may have grown to despise the monsters that his sire and their siblings had become. Regardless of his involvement, the first city fell, and the world was covered in a deluge for 40 days and 40 nights. And once it had subsided, Saulot would leave his siblings and his spawn behind as he journeyed far into the east to study disciplines unknown to his people. Saulot sought at first to understand the beast, but as his studies progressed, he became instead convinced he needed to subdue it, to tame it, and thus achieve enlightenment. There are some who believe, enemies of the Salubri for certain, that it was Saulot who, while pondering the true nature of the beast, created those who would become the founders of the wretched clan of Bali, but there is little stock in this rumor, for it is nothing but such. Even so, once we speak of those unholy infernals further, I may expand on that theory. What is known is that he was gone for centuries, none of his progeny knowing his whereabouts, and when he returned, he did so with a third eye opened upon his forehead, and wisdom and enlightenment far beyond the understanding of his peers. He had achieved, at least it is claimed, Golconda, the fabled state of transition, where a Cainite needs no longer sustain themselves on the blood of mortals, and are no longer harried by the beast of their founder's curse. Those Salubri who joined him then would study under him to become healers of the mind. They would seek to master Golconda and spread its teachings to other Cainites. Saulot had also developed a new discipline called Valoran, and it was through the usage of it that the third eye was opened. For a while, some curious Cainites of the other clans wondered at this enlightenment, but the majority of them were too preoccupied with their earthly affairs to pay much attention to this path of enlightenment, as to many of them it seemed to go against their very nature and the many gifts that Cain's blood had granted them. This period of teaching was brief, however, because only a short while after Saulot's return, a dark, foreboding presence arose in the east and approached the lands of the second city rapidly. It was the Bali, demon-worshipping Cainites of unknown origin. Saulot, who otherwise had rarely had cause to raise arms against others, proclaimed these Bali anathema and roused his childer to fight them. Yet the Salubri were not warriors, and so they fared poorly against the Bali, who were driven by unholy powers, and who made dark and twisted sacrifices of all the mortals they found. Samuel, one of Saulot's own childer, had never fared well as a scholar and a healer. It is unknown why the clan's founder had chosen someone like him to become one of the unicorns, but perhaps it was his prophetic visions that hinted at the future duty of his progeny. Seeing the slaughter that the Bali had wrought, Samuel cast aside his role as a healer and took up the blade of a warrior and founded amongst the Salubri the warrior caste. Some say that Samuel had done this as early as the first city of Enoch. But like many things concerning the First Bali War, the truth of these events remain unblemished only in the memories of a few individuals, none of whom have seen fit to provide an accurate account. Regardless of how it came to pass, Samuel formed the Salubri warriors, a second caste to his clan, and the demands put upon these warriors to not only fight, but to do so for reasons of sanctity and purity, for good and for protection, were deeply scored in the minds of these Cainites. To learn the ways of war, Samuel trained with the warriors of the other clans, primarily the Bruja and Gangrel, and came to know their ways, but never strayed from the path of doing good that he had been taught. Stories conflict on what happened first, but one retelling says that Samuel sent 4 of his warriors to investigate the rumors of the approaching Bali, yet only one returned, after 2 months, and nearly driven mad from terror. Once he could speak, he did so, and told the others of how 2 of the 4 had been diablerized by the Bali. Once finished, The survivor chose to end his own existence in the rising sun, and Saulot was furious over how his blood had been not only slain, but destroyed utterly through the Amaranth. Samiel shall then have sworn to stand against this threat with his warriors, and, unaided by any clan but Malkovs, who sympathized with their brother's plight, went to war against the Bali. The first Bali War was a horrid affair of which little was documented, thankfully, but at its end Samiel had been slain, as had over half of his warriors. Saulot was grief-struck and isolated himself for many years, while Uriel, a charge of Samiel's, found the writings of Samiel's which would later form the warrior's code, from which they would all study and try to live by. Uriel, Saafiel, Ezrael, Ariel, and Gabriel were the 5 warriors who would form the lineages of the warrior caste from then on, and they each carried the tradition of Samiel's warrior code with them. These warriors would then spread out across the lands, learning from other masters of warfare and embracing those they would see as suitable candidates to carry on their legacy. They would wage war constantly, joining in human conflicts as well as Cainite, and should there be no war, they would pursue the Bali and any allies of them, granting no quarters to the demon worshippers. These warriors would sometimes pursue Golconda as well, and were capable even of achieving it, but they were also capable of great evil. When Saulot was destroyed by the usurpers, a few of the warriors abandoned their path of justice and good, instead taking on the names of Lucifer's fallen angels and setting out to right this wrong and take back from the Tremere what had been taken from them. Ultimately, this attempt failed, because it was not by the hands of these Salubri that the Tremere's mighty pyramid fell. But in regards to those matters, we shall speak later. We must instead turn our eyes upon the healers as well, who, like their clan's founder, rarely embraced, and often kept to themselves unless it was time to induct a new soul into their ranks. The healers were scholars and miracle workers, curing diseases and spreading the philosophy of Golconda on their journeys. It is said that Valerian, the discipline of healing, was easily corrupted by impure thoughts and acts, and thus the Salubri had to ensure that they followed the strict moral code set upon them by their founder, lest their powers cause harm instead of good. It behooves me to mention that there is some confusion as to when exactly Saulot attained Golconda. Some claim it was after his first travel to the east, before the Bali, yet other accounts say that he left for the east once more after the First War, and that he met the Buddha himself, and it was only afterwards that he would achieve this nirvana of the Cainite condition. When the second city fell, the Salubri were already far too spread that it caused them little harm, and in fact their founder was said to be in torpor at the time, or soon after it, turning his attention once more inwards to further deepen his understanding of the clan's condition. Some say this was after a third visit to the east, and that he felt confident in the legacy he had left for his childer. Having achieved Golconda, he had no need to interfere in their journeys towards it, and thus left it alone. Some say that Saulot's torpor was brought on by the second war against the Bali, a war in which all 13 clans stood together against this demonic threat. But as the clan suffered heavy losses from it, leaving few who know the exact tale, this can only be supposed and not confirmed. The effect of this war, however, left the clan even more widespread and insular than before. This would not be to their clan's favor later on, as the Tremere, power-hungry and desperate for legitimacy among the other clans of Cainites, set their eyes on Saulot and the potent vitae in his veins. This video was brought to you by my patrons, of whom I would especially like to thank the Antediluvian Bambi Parsons, the Methuselahs, Danny, Socrates Johnson, and Alexander Kishtaria, the Primogen Council of Bled, Lauren Eason, Nikolai Marius Voiculescu, and Procyon. The Elders, The Only Body, Casper 99, Non-God, and Quinn Sullivan. And the Ancillae, Tsunder Lobster, Yodan, Evelyn, Harry Wyckoff, and Isaac Flynn. Your patience and support means the world to me. I would especially like to thank my mods for the Discord community, Evelyn, Toring, Bambi, and Idrin for your hard work. Thank you for being there when I could not. And thank you for listening. Now be careful out there, for Gehenna may soon be upon us.